My sister stood in my mother's kitchen, looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Angela, you can't even afford your own rent. You really think you're paying for Dad's birthday dinner?" She laughed. My mother didn't correct her. She just looked down at her hands, like I wasn't even worth a response. I was 27 years old, standing in the house I grew up in, and somehow I had never felt smaller. But here's what neither of them knew. I had been carrying a secret for 18 months, a secret that had consumed every single weekend, every late night, every dollar I could scrape together, a secret that had cost me sleep, relationships, and more tears than I could count. And in less than 48 hours, that secret was going to walk into the room and change everything. When we arrived at the restaurant my sister had chosen, one of the most exclusive in all of Boston, the maitre d' didn't put us on a waiting list. He didn't ask for our reservation name. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "Welcome back, Ms. Valdez. Your family is here. We've been expecting you." My mother's jaw dropped. My sister turned white. And my father, the man whose birthday we were celebrating, started to cry. Stay with me. Because what happened that night was not about revenge. It was about truth, about dignity, about what it means to be seen by the people who should have been cheering for you all along. And if you've ever been counted out by the people closest to you, if you've ever had to prove yourself to a room that was already sure you'd fail, you're going to want to watch every single second of this. Before we go any further, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Not for me. For every version of yourself that sat in silence while someone talked over you, dismissed you, or made you feel like your dreams were too big for your hands. This story gets harder before it gets better, but I promise you, it is worth it. Subscribe, and stay with me. My name is Angela Valdez, and I am 27 years old. I grew up in a loud house in East Boston, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows your name, your grandmother's name, and the story of the argument your parents had at the block party in 2003. We were a tight-knit family, big Sunday dinners, birthday parties that spilled out onto the sidewalk. My father, Emilio Valdez, was the kind of man people gravitated toward, warm, generous, always the last to leave a room. My mother, Bianca Valdez, was the family's backbone, a woman who had sacrificed her entire 20s to raise 3 kids while working double shifts at a hospital laundry facility. She was tough, she was proud, and she had very specific ideas about what success was supposed to look like. Then there was my sister, Sarah. Sarah was 4 years older than me and had done everything right, at least by our mother's definition. She had gone to college on a partial scholarship, graduated with a business degree, married a man named Jonathan who wore blazers and drove a Volvo, and now lived in a condo in Cambridge with 2 cats and a standing dinner reservation at places I'd never been invited to. Sarah had never, not once, let me forget any of this. "You're too scattered, Angela," she'd say at every family gathering. "You start things and you don't finish them. Remember the photography thing? Remember the catering idea? You're creative, sure, but creativity doesn't pay rent." The worst part? She wasn't entirely wrong. At least, not about my history. I had tried things, many things. I'd taken a photography class and loved it, but couldn't afford to build a real portfolio. I'd tried to start a small catering business with my friend Natalie when we were 22, but it fell apart when our first client pulled out and we didn't have the capital to survive. I'd done freelance graphic design work, waitressed at 4 different restaurants across the city, taken online courses in marketing, in business operations, in food and beverage management. To my mother and Sarah, this looked like chaos, distraction, failure wearing different costumes. To me, it was research, it was preparation, it was 1,000 small lessons building towards something I hadn't yet been able to name out loud. My father was different. Emilio Valdez never made me feel small, not once, even when he was exhausted after a 12-hour shift at the shipping yard, even when money was so tight that dinners were rice and beans 3 nights in a row, he'd pull me aside and say, "Angie, mi amor, your brain works like nobody else's. You wait. Your time is coming." He was the only one who saw me, truly saw me. Which is why his birthday meant everything. It started with a text. My cousin Shakira sent a message to the family group chat, the one with 37 members and a constant chaotic stream of memes, prayer emojis and unsolicited opinions, that read, "Okay everyone, Dad's Uncle Emilio's 60th birthday is in 3 weeks. We are doing a big dinner. Who's organizing?" Within minutes, Sarah had replied, "I'll handle the restaurant. I know a place." Of course she did. 2 days later, she sent another message, this time with a link to a restaurant called Castello, a high-end Italian establishment in downtown Boston that had been on the city's best new restaurants list for the past 2 years. The prix-fixe menu started at $180 per person. There were going to be 14 people at dinner. I did the math in my head and felt my stomach drop. But I didn't say anything. I wasn't going to be the one to complain, not about my father's birthday. I quietly confirmed that I'd be there and started figuring out my contribution. 3 days before the dinner, I was sitting at my kitchen table, the small apartment in Dorchester that I'd shared with my friend Dante for the past year, when my phone rang. It was Sarah. "Hey," she said without warmth. "I'm calling about Dad's dinner." "Yeah, I saw the reservation confirmation. I'm excited." "Angela," there was a pause. "The dinner is going to be expensive. I just want to make sure you're going to be able to cover your portion, because the last thing we need is an awkward moment at the table." I felt heat rise in my chest. "I'll be fine, Sarah. I'm just asking because last Christmas you asked Mom for money for the Uber home and—" "I'll be fine," my voice was flat. "I'll cover my portion." Another pause, then, "Okay, just making sure. See you Saturday." She hung up. I sat there for a long moment. Then I put my phone down, walked to my window and looked out at the street below. The bodega on the corner, the kids riding bikes, the woman from 3B hanging laundry on her fire escape. And I smiled. Because Sarah had no idea. None of them did. 18 months earlier, I had done something terrifying. I had taken every dollar I'd saved over 4 years of waitressing, $31,000, kept in a savings account I never touched, and I had partnered with a man named Bruno Vasquez, a veteran restaurateur who had been looking for someone with hustle, creativity, and a vision he could build around. I had met Bruno at one of the 4 restaurants where I'd waitressed. He was a quiet, intense man in his 50s who had owned 3 successful establishments in the city over the past 2 decades. He was semi-retired and bored, and when he saw how I handled a difficult Friday night rush, managing 6 tables, a kitchen dispute, and a VIP guest who threatened to leave, he pulled me aside after my shift and said, "You're wasted here. Come have coffee with me tomorrow." We had coffee, and then we had dinner. And then we had a 6-hour meeting in a rented conference room, where I laid out everything I had ever learned, every note I had ever taken, every idea I had ever had for a restaurant that felt like home, like warmth and honesty and real food made with care. And Bruno listened to every word. 3 weeks later, we signed a partnership agreement. His connections, his license, his industry relationships. My vision, my design, my menu concept, my name eventually on the lease. We called it Solaire, Italian for sunny, for warmth, for light. And we opened quietly, intentionally, without fanfare. No big press release, no social media blitz, just word of mouth, a soft launch, and 18 months of grinding until the restaurant found its footing. I had told almost no one. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned something from years of watching my ideas get dismissed before they'd barely left my mouth. Some things need to grow in the dark before they're ready for the light. Dante knew. My childhood friend Ronnie knew. And Bruno's wife, a lovely woman named Sally, who brought us homemade soup on late nights during the renovation, knew. That was it. My mother didn't know. Sarah didn't know. And my father, the man who had believed in me when no one else did, didn't know either. Because I wanted to show him, not tell him. I wanted to watch his face when he walked through the door and understood. That moment had always been the plan. His 60th birthday was always the plan. And Sarah, without knowing it, had just handed me the perfect stage. I need to pause right here for just a second. Because if you're still watching, you already know this story is going somewhere. You can feel it building. And I want you to know, whatever you're carrying right now, whatever dream you've had to protect in secret because the people around you couldn't handle it yet, you are not alone. If this story is touching something in you, if you're rooting for Angela the way I hope you are, please take 2 seconds and subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this, stories about quietly building, about enduring, about proving your worth without screaming it, these are the stories that matter. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share this video with them. Now, let's get back to Saturday night. The morning of my father's birthday, I was at Solaire by 7 a.m. My head chef, a brilliant and precise woman named Milan, had already been there since 5. The kitchen smelled like roasted garlic and fresh bread, and something citrusy that I couldn't immediately identify but instantly loved. "How are we looking?" I asked, dropping my bag on the office chair. "Ready," Milan said, with the confidence of someone who had prepared for this night like a military campaign. "The private dining room is set. Lorenzo has the wine pairings confirmed. Alex is running the front of house tonight and he's been briefed. He knows who the VIPs are and what tonight means." I nodded. I had given Alex, my head of front of house operations, a full briefing the previous week. He knew about my family. He knew about my father. He knew the moment was important. What he hadn't expected was that he'd need to keep his own expression neutral when a woman who looked exactly like the sister I'd described showed up believing she had made the reservation. Because here's the part I haven't told you yet. Sarah had called Castello, the restaurant she'd chosen, and made a reservation for 14 at 7 p.m. on Saturday. What Sarah didn't know was that Castello had been booked solid for the next 6 weeks. What Sarah also didn't know was that 3 weeks before the dinner, the owner of Castello, a man named David Sean, who I happened to know professionally through Bruno, had called me to mention that a woman named Sarah Marchetti had called, requesting a large group reservation for a family birthday. "I told her we were fully booked," David said, with the slightly apologetic tone of someone delivering news they know will complicate someone else's life. "She was not happy about it. I thought you should know in case it affects your family plans." I had sat with that information for 48 hours. And then I had called Alex. "Alex," I said, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to call a woman named Sarah Marchetti and offer her a reservation at Solaire. Tell her you're calling from a hospitality concierge service, which you kind of are, and that you've been able to secure a private dining experience for her party of 14 on Saturday at 7 p.m. Tell her the chef has prepared a special menu in honor of the occasion. Don't mention my name." There was a brief silence. "Are you serious?" "Completely." Another silence. Then, "Angela, this is either the most brilliant thing you've ever done or the most chaotic." "Probably both," I said. "Are you in?" "Absolutely in." The guests arrived in waves. My aunts and uncles, Emilio's siblings, Bianca's sisters, cousins from all branches of the family, drifted in between 6:45 and 7, greeted warmly at the door by Alex in a sharp black suit. He shook hands, took coats, offered champagne with the relaxed authority of someone who had been doing this for decades. I watched from the corridor behind the kitchen, through a small window that let me see the dining room without being seen. I watched my Tio Anthony walk in and look around with wide eyes at the vaulted ceilings and warm amber lighting. I watched my cousin Natalie, my former catering partner, the only other person who had believed in me back when we were failing together, step inside and immediately clock the framed art on the walls, the hand-lettered menus, the arrangement of dried flowers cascading from the ceiling installation we'd spent 3 weekends perfecting. She didn't know it was my restaurant, but I watched her look around with an expression that said she felt something here. I watched my father walk through the door. Emilio Valdez was 60 years old, but he carried it like a man who had made peace with time. He was stocky, silver-haired, with deep-set eyes that always seemed to be looking for something to appreciate. He walked in slowly, one hand in the pocket of the new blazer my mother had bought him, and he looked around the room with the kind of quiet wonder that made something catch in my throat. And then I watched Sarah walk in. She was talking to Jonathan, animated, confident, and she swept in with the posture of a woman who believed she had arranged all of this. She had her hair done. She was wearing a dress I recognized as expensive. She had her moment prepared. I let them get settled. I let them have champagne. I let them read the menus and make small talk, and let my father hug every person at the table twice. And then I walked out. I have replayed this moment in my mind so many times since then that it's taken on a quality that feels almost cinematic. But I want to try to describe it the way it actually happened, not the way I've polished it in memory, because the reality was messier and more emotional than any version I could choreograph. I came out of the corridor in my chef's whites. That part was intentional. I wanted them to understand immediately, not gradually, what was happening. I walked to the edge of the private dining room, and Alex caught my eye and gave a small nod. The table went quiet in the way that tables go quiet when someone new enters the room, and there's something about them that changes the air. My father saw me first. He frowned, not with displeasure, but with the confused frown of a man trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he expected to see. He had thought I was already at the table. He was looking for the waitress in chef's whites, and instead he found his daughter. "Angie?" he said. And that one word, my nickname in his voice, almost took me out completely. I crossed the room to him. I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, "Happy birthday, Papa." He looked at me, then at my whites, then around the room, then back at me. "This is," he started, then stopped. "This is mine," I said quietly. "This is Solaire. I own this restaurant, Papa. I've owned it for a year and a half, and tonight I wanted you to be here. I wanted to celebrate 60 years of your life in a place that your belief in me helped build." There was a beat of absolute silence. And then my father, Emilio Valdez, a man I had never once seen cry at anything harder than a wedding, put his face in his hands and wept. Not softly, not politely. He wept with his whole chest, the kind of cry that comes from a place so deep it surprises even the person it belongs to. I put my arms around him. I felt him shake. Around us the table was perfectly, completely still. It took a few minutes for the room to recalibrate. My aunts and uncles were crying or on the verge of it. My cousin Natalie had her hand over her mouth. My Tio Anthony stood up and started clapping, which broke the silence and started a wave of applause that felt almost overwhelming in the small warm space. My mother sat very still. Sarah sat very still. When the emotion of the immediate moment had settled, when my father had pulled back and laughed at himself for crying, when people had started hugging me and asking questions and exclaiming over the space, I felt Sarah's eyes on me. I turned to look at her. She had gone a particular shade of pale that I recognized from childhood. It was the color she turned when she had done something she couldn't undo. Jonathan was looking at the table. I walked over to where Sarah was sitting. I didn't do it with anger. I want to be clear about that. By the time that night arrived, I had processed enough of my feelings about my sister to know that I didn't want to humiliate her. I didn't want the night to be about her failure. I wanted it to be about my father's joy. But I also wasn't going to pretend. I pulled out the empty chair beside her. She was at the corner of the table, and I sat down. "Hey," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were bright in a way that told me she was fighting to hold something in. "Angela." "You don't have to say anything tonight," I said. "This isn't about that. Tonight is about Dad. I paused, but I do want to say one thing. She waited. 3 weeks ago, you called me to ask if I could afford my portion of the dinner. Do you remember? She closed her eyes briefly. Yes. I've been building this for 1.5 years. I wanted to show Dad. I wanted it to be a surprise, so I kept it quiet. I know that from the outside it looked like I was still spinning my wheels. I took a breath. I'm not angry at you, Sarah, but I need you to know that I see you. And I need you to start seeing me, who I actually am, not who you decided I was 10 years ago. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, I didn't know. I know you didn't. I stood up. Come on, let's go enjoy Dad's birthday. She nodded. And when I looked at her face, I saw something I hadn't seen from my sister in years. It looked a lot like respect. My mother was harder. Bianca Valdez was not a woman who apologized easily. She was built from a generation that expressed love through action, through cooking, through sacrifice, through making sure there was always food in the refrigerator and money in the emergency envelope, taped to the back of the bathroom mirror. Emotion was not her language. Vulnerability was not something she had ever been taught to offer. But after dinner, after my head chef Milan had sent out a tasting menu that reduced 3 of my aunts to silent reverence, after Lorenzo had paired each course with wines that made my father shake his head in disbelief, after the cake had come out and the singing had happened and my father had blown out 60 candles while everyone cheered, after all of that, my mother found me in the corridor near the kitchen. She was holding a glass of wine. She looked older than I usually let myself see her, and smaller, in a way that startled me. Angie, she said. Mama. She looked around the corridor, at the exposed brick, the copper pipe shelving, the framed photograph of the Boston Harbor that we'd hung at the turn of the hallway. She took in each detail slowly, and I could see her recalibrating, reconstructing who I was against the evidence in front of her. How long? She asked. 1.5 years. She nodded, drank from her glass. Why didn't you tell me? I considered how to answer this honestly without cruelty, because the last time I told you about something I was building, you told me to be realistic, and I couldn't afford to hear that, not this time. Her face tightened. I was trying to protect you. I know, Mama, my voice was gentle. But I needed you to believe in me, not just protect me. The silence between us was long, not uncomfortable, just full. Weighted with everything a mother and daughter carry between them, all the words spoken and unspoken over 27 years. Finally, she reached out and put her hand on my arm, just her hand, no words. But her eyes said everything. And I let it be enough. Because sometimes with the people we love, enough is everything. The night ended late, later than any of us had planned, because no one wanted to leave. My father sat at the head of the table until nearly midnight, surrounded by people who loved him, in a room that his daughter had built with her own hands and her own stubborn surviving heart. He told me, before he left, that this was the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. Not the restaurant itself, though he was astonished by it, but the proof. The proof that the thing he had always seen in me was real, that he hadn't been wrong to believe. I always told you, he said, holding both my hands in his. Your time was coming. You told me, I agreed. In the weeks that followed, things shifted. Sarah called me 3 days after the dinner. The call was short and a little awkward. But it ended with her asking if she could bring Jonathan to dinner at Solaire sometime. Not for a family event, not for any occasion, just to come and eat and be there. I told her I'd put her name on the list. My mother started asking questions, not about the restaurant specifically, but about me, about what I was learning, what was hard, what I was proud of. They were the kinds of questions she had never thought to ask before, and they were imperfect, and sometimes they landed sideways, but they were real. And I answered them. My cousin Natalie came in for lunch 2 weeks later. When she found out I was the owner, she sat across from me and said, You know what's insane? When we were failing at the catering thing and I felt so bad about it, you kept saying, "This is research. This is all research." I thought you were just trying to make me feel better. She shook her head. You actually meant it. I laughed. I actually meant it. She raised her glass of sparkling water. To research. To research. I've told you this story because it's mine, but I don't think I'm the only one who has lived some version of it. I know what it's like to sit at a table full of people who love you and still feel completely alone. I know what it's like to have someone you love speak about your future in a tone that sounds more like a eulogy than a hope. I know the specific, suffocating feeling of carrying something you believe in when no one around you seems to share that belief. I know what it's like to want to shout, "I am building something. Can't you see that? Can you not see me?" And I know the discipline, the painful, humbling discipline of not shouting, of staying quiet, of protecting the thing you're building from the people who might, even with love in their hearts, damage it before it's strong enough to survive. There is a version of this story where I told everyone what I was doing and let their doubt talk me out of it. There is a version where I listened to Sarah's voice in my ear instead of my own. There is a version where I never called Bruno, never signed the lease, never stood in an empty restaurant at 2 a.m. crying because the floor installation had gone wrong and I didn't know if I could afford to fix it. There are 100 versions of this story where it doesn't end the way it did. But here's what I've learned. Your silence is not weakness, it is strategy, it is protection, it is love for the version of yourself that is still becoming. Not everyone deserves an invitation to watch you build. Some people can only be shown the finished room. And there is nothing wrong with that. Show them the finished room. I want to pull back the curtain a little more because I think people imagine that building something in secret is purely about hiding it. That's not what it was for me. The secrecy was a byproduct of focus. In those 18 months between signing the partnership with Bruno and the night of my father's birthday dinner, my life was almost comically unglamorous. I was still waitressing part-time at a restaurant on Newberry Street to pay my rent, because I wasn't yet drawing a salary from Solaire. I was at the restaurant every day that I wasn't waitressing. I was learning things I had never learned: how to negotiate with suppliers, how to manage a team of people with wildly different personalities and skill sets, how to read a P&L statement, how to handle a health inspection, how to deal with the very specific chaos of a kitchen during a dinner rush. I made mistakes, many of them. I hired a line cook named John, who turned out to be brilliant but deeply unreliable. He disappeared for 3 days without explanation in our second month of operation, leaving Milan to cover with a skeleton crew. I had to let him go, and the conversation was one of the hardest I'd had up to that point. I over-ordered on a produce delivery in November and lost $800 worth of vegetables to spoilage because I hadn't yet internalized how dramatically covers could swing week to week. I had a vendor dispute with a dishware supplier named Vasquez & Sons that almost derailed our opening timeline, and I sat in that office at midnight with a spreadsheet open and my head in my hands wondering if I had made a catastrophic mistake. But I also had Milan, who is the most capable and calm person I have ever worked with. I had Alex, who somehow managed to build a front-of-house culture in 8 months that felt like it had existed for years. I had Bruno, who showed up every Wednesday to walk the floor and talk with me for 2 hours about what was working and what wasn't, and who never once made me feel like a junior partner even when I clearly was. I had Dante, who put up with the fact that I came home at midnight smelling like kitchen and collapsed on the couch, and who occasionally slid a plate of food in front of me without comment because he knew I'd probably forgotten to eat. And I had my father's voice in my head, always. Your time is coming, Angie. Your time is coming. I want to go back and tell you more about the reservation situation, because I think it reveals something important. When David Sean called me to let me know Sarah had tried to book Costello, my first instinct was complicated. Part of me wanted to just leave it, let her figure it out, watch her scramble. But that wasn't who I wanted to be. I sat with it for 2 days, and then I called Alex and I made the plan. And in making that plan, I had to decide something important. What is this night for? It would have been easy to engineer a moment of maximum humiliation. To let Sarah seat herself at my restaurant before she knew it was mine. To let her play the role of gracious host for 20 minutes before the reveal, to extract maximum dramatic impact from her discomfort. I didn't want that. I wanted my father to be celebrated. I wanted the night to be about his 60 years of life, his love, his impact on everyone at that table. I wanted the food to be extraordinary, and the room to be beautiful, and the people in it to feel, when they left, that something real had happened. That they had been present for something that mattered. The revelation of my ownership was always going to happen. I had been planning this for months, but I chose how it happened. I chose to let it be quiet and personal and honest. I chose to walk out in my chef's whites and speak first to my father, not to the room. I chose to go to Sarah after the emotion had settled, not in the middle of it. That choice cost me something. There is a part of me, I won't pretend otherwise, that would have liked 5 more minutes of watching Sarah realize what she was sitting in. I'm human, I'm not a saint. But I know that the choice I made is the one that let me sleep at night. It's the one that let the night be what it was supposed to be, and it's the one that left a door open with my sister, instead of closing it permanently. This is something I think about a lot when it comes to moments of quiet justice. You can be right and still choose grace. And choosing grace doesn't mean you're soft, it means you're clear about what victory actually looks like. My victory was the restaurant. My victory was my father's tears. My victory was 18 months of work and sacrifice finally standing in front of the people who had doubted me, not to say I told you so, but to say, look, I made something real. I made something that will last. That was the victory. Everything else was just theater. I want to tell you about Bruno Vasquez, because without him this story doesn't exist. Bruno is a man who has, in his own words, made every mistake it is possible to make in the restaurant business. He opened his first restaurant at 28, failed at 30, rebuilt at 34, and by 50 had developed a reputation as someone who could smell potential in a space and in a person with an accuracy that bordered on unsettling. When he offered me coffee that day after my shift, I was terrified. I thought I was either in trouble or being offered something that would turn out to be not what it seemed. I almost didn't go. I'm glad I went. Bruno taught me something in those 18 months that I didn't expect. I thought the hard parts would be the business parts, the contracts, the numbers, the logistics, and those were hard. But the hardest part, the part one had to learn most painfully, was people. Managing people who are more experienced than you. Earning the trust of a kitchen where the head chef had been working in fine dining for 15 years and could have resented being supervised by someone half her age. Building relationships with suppliers who had never heard of you. Creating a floor culture where staff feel respected and supported, so they stay. So the consistency that a restaurant lives or dies by is actually achievable. Bruno was patient with me through all of this, but he was also honest. You are going to make people angry, he told me once in the 4th month, when I had handled a staff conflict in a way that I thought was fair, but that had created friction I hadn't anticipated. Not because you're doing it wrong. Because you're learning how to do it right, and learning always makes mistakes, and mistakes always affect people. That's unavoidable. What is avoidable is letting mistakes harden you. Stay soft enough to hear the feedback. Stay hard enough to make the decision anyway. I wrote that down. I still have it on a post-it note on my office wall. People romanticize restaurant ownership. I did too, before I was doing it. The reality is that it is one of the most demanding, variable, emotionally exhausting things a person can choose to do. The margins are thin, the hours are long. The list of things that can go wrong on any given service is so long that you learn, eventually, to simply accept the chaos as the baseline condition and work from there. But there are also moments. There are moments when you walk through your dining room on a busy Friday night, the kitchen in its orchestrated frenzy, the tables full of people deep in conversation and laughter, the music threading through it all, and you feel something that I can only describe as rightness. Like this is exactly where you were supposed to be. There are moments when a guest stops you on the way out and says, I don't know how to explain it, but this felt like home. There are moments when Milan walks out of the kitchen after service, tired and flour-dusted and completely calm, and says good night. And you know that what you've built together is something she's proud to be part of. These moments are the ones you work for. These are the ones that make the 2 a.m. spreadsheets and the difficult vendor calls and the staffing nightmares and the moments of pure terror when you look at your accounts and wonder if you've made a catastrophic mistake. They make all of it worthwhile. My father visited the restaurant for the first time as a regular guest, not for a family event, but just on a Tuesday evening with my mother, about 3 weeks after the birthday dinner. I didn't know they were coming. Alex texted me from the floor. Your parents are here. Want me to seat them in your section? I came out and found them at a corner table, looking at the menus with the focused expressions of people who are taking something seriously. My father looked up when he heard me approaching. He had a glass of red wine in front of him and his reading glasses on, and he looked completely at ease, the way he looked at Sunday dinners when he'd managed to arrive before the chaos started and could sit in peace. I brought your mother, he said, like this needed explanation. I can see that, I said, and I pulled up a chair. My mother, without looking up from the menu, said, "What do you recommend?" And I laughed, actually laughed from the bottom of my chest, because if that isn't love, in the language of Bianca Valdez, I don't know what is. I want to spend a moment talking directly to you. If you are in the middle of building something that the people around you don't know about yet, or worse, something that the people around you know about and have already dismissed, this part is for you. I know how it feels to be in the middle. The middle is the hardest place. The beginning has the energy of starting. The end has the clarity of arriving. But the middle is where doubt lives. The middle is where you've already spent too much time and too much money and too much of yourself to turn back. But you can't yet see the finish line clearly enough to feel certain. The middle is where most people stop. Don't stop. I know that sounds easy for me to say, now that I'm standing in a restaurant that bears my vision and has my name on the lease. I know that success stories always sound inevitable in retrospect, and I know that from the outside, what looks like courage sometimes felt like nothing more than an inability to admit defeat. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe stubbornness and faith are just the same thing wearing different clothes. But here is what I know for certain. The night I sat across from Sarah on the phone and told her I'd cover my portion of the dinner, the night I said those words without flinching even though my heart was hammering, that was the night I knew I was going to be okay, not because I had the restaurant, but because I had decided, somewhere deep in my bones, that no one else was going to define my story. You are the author of your own story. Other people can offer opinions, they can offer doubt, they can offer judgment dressed up as concern, but they cannot write what happens next. Only you can write what happens next. So keep writing. We're at the end of this story, and I want to ask you something. Not about me. Not about Angela Valdez or Soler or birthday dinners or family drama. I want to ask about you. Is there something you're building right now that the people around you don't know about? Something you're protecting in the quiet because you're not sure the world is ready to see it yet? Is there someone in your life, a Sarah, a Bianca, who has accidentally or deliberately made you feel like the dream is too big for your hands? If that's you, this channel is for you. This is a space for people who are still in the building phase, for people who are choosing faith over fear even when it costs them, for people who know, somewhere beneath the doubt and the exhaustion and the overwhelming odds, that their time is coming. If that's you, subscribe right now. Because we are telling those stories here, the real ones, the ones that don't skip the hard parts, the ones where the victory is not given but earned, not declared but proven, not easy but real. Subscribe. Leave a comment below telling me, what are you building? What are you protecting? What do you want the world to see when you're finally ready to show it? I read every single comment, and I want to know. This is Angela Valdez, owner of Soler, and I am just getting started. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and quietly building something real.